Welcome back, dear listeners, dear viewers, to one more highlight of the book, Action and Reaction. Today, Kirsten and I, almost towards the end of this beautiful book, discussing chapter 19, entitled Sanctions and Assistance. Before we go into the discussion of sanctions and assistance that we're going to be discussing here, let us try to understand, let's try to picture what's happening in this chapter. They start, Andre Luiz starts by saying that they were, after attending some of the patients in Mansão Paz, they have no other than Druso to give them some guidance and actually answer some questions that they perhaps had about the whole teaching, about the whole, action, reaction.
Who's the head of Mansão Paz?
Who's the head of Mansão Paz, that is correct. So imagine having the head of an institution like Mansão Paz, giving them, bit of, new understanding about this idea, especially the idea of sanction and assistance. But Druso, very eloquently, starts talking about this mental renewal, a triad, right, as we were able to pick up here. We're not going to go too much in detail because, again, we invite everyone to read and make sure that you dive into this study as well. But there are three things here, this mental renewal, right? And the triad is pattern for goodness, importance for study to reach higher knowledge, service to our neighbor to harvest goodwill.
Right.
What is that in our daily lives? How can we kind of digest it or apply this in our daily lives?
I think, Leo, I think in so many ways, it's interesting because one of the first things he brings is this mental renewal regarding patterns for the good. And, Leo, when we were studying this, we were talking about this idea of the triad, of the triangle. And just to touch on that, to sort of highlight that a little bit as well, because how often in our day-to-day life do we take time out for mental renewal? How often during our day do we take a small break, whether going to the bathroom or to our car, or just take a breather to renew our mind? But they tell us it's important for this mental renewal regarding patterns for the good. And perhaps we can even go as far as conclude to say, in order for us to create new patterns, we must refresh our mind. We must, restabilize ourselves, because sometimes we can we're not so evolved yet, right? We get so caught up in our day-to-day lives, we need to take a moment to renew ourselves. And also, he mentions the importance of study, like you said, because it's important to obtain higher knowledge, and also the service to our neighbors. So it's so beautiful, because although we need to work on ourselves, we need to do our own mental renewal, we also cannot forget to serve others. So this can happen in our day-to-day life. It can happen in our workplace. We can assist people. Oftentimes throughout the literature, we know that in Spiritism, even Joanna de Andres tells us to look for those who are in need before they come and ask you for help, or even some people don't like to ask for help. So perhaps in our workplace environment, in our home, we can find these opportunities to serve, right?
It is very true. And we see here that it's a calling to all of us to break the old patterns, right?
Right.
To, again, we should renew ourselves. Perhaps if we have lived our lives in a specific way, doing certain things every single day, let's take a moment. Let's revisit these actions and really think about it before any action. There is a thought behind it. So I think the calling is here. Let us think. Let us really prepare ourselves to what's to come, not just January 1st or before the new year comes, that we do that, that mentalization, okay, what am I going to do? What's, the new year? So let us do this daily. Let's have, refresh our minds. So I think it's very pertinent to all of us.
And I think it leads us into something else that they begin to dive into, basically because the whole chapter discusses about this new perspective of disease in the physical body, or disease in general. They really, in this chapter, we really urge people to go and read it because it's so beautiful. It's a confirmation, because holistic medicine, I mean, even we can say this with all certainty in our mind, that in the 1980s, even the National Health Institute for Health had to create a whole new website called NCAM, the National Center for Alternative Medicine, to address the need of the people that were searching this alternative medicine. So we see here, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, that there is an alternative medicine that exists.
It's interesting that as Druso starts to explain all these diseases and all these cases, they have, as they say, Andre Luiz portray to us, a singular sculpture that was placed next to him, next to Druso, showing the whole physical body as the whole, and it functioning in a way as well, showing what was going on to help illustrate what he was talking about. And he brings several diseases, right?
He brings so many, which is beautiful, because in any good medical school, nursing school, really any type of medical related type of schooling, you're going to see that. You're going to see the sculptures of the human body. For sure, not as detailed and beautiful as Mansell Paz has, but they utilize that for their learning, for their discussion that they had. And you're right, they go into so many details about how certain diseases basically are caused by us, a large part. And we know this because the gospel, according to Spiritism, it tells us that we cause at least a large part of half of all of our suffering. So we urge, again, our viewers, our listeners, to read this part in the chapter about it, right, Leo? And specifically about these disease processes that go on. But Leo, there's one particular part, and it's in page 248, that talks about this idea, and we love this because we're going to quote directly. People can read in 248. He says that that medicine should consider the patient as a psychosomatic whole if it really wants to invest itself in the art of healing. So psychosomatic is basically mind, body, and spirit. And Leo, we were discussing about this, that really Spiritism recognizes that the mind is a reflection of the spirit. So when we can say mind and body, acknowledging that there is mind, body, and spirit, but for all intents and purposes, because that's the New Age thing to say, mind, body, and spirit. But that's interesting, right? That Druso is saying that medicine needs to, or should, look at the patient from this mind, body, soul perspective, from this triple aspect, that it's not just the physical body, which is oftentimes what happens, right, when you go to the doctor.
It brings, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of responsibility, but the responsibility is not, the problems that we're facing nowadays, physically speaking, if we have a pathology or something, it's not caused by the body directly, the physical body. There is a mind behind it, a commanding chief that is behind this body. And it is the spirit, the mind that we're describing over here. It is important for us to say that for us, yes, just as you mentioned, Spiritists, we ought to understand this way, that it's just a reflection of the spirit, but so we can kind of break it down still, to say the mind, the spirit. So it's really important for us to really put that responsibility on us. And also not push the responsibility on our parents, perhaps, when we think that, I inherited this from my parents, from my family members. So no, the responsibility is ours, definitely.
And that's even a whole other topic in and of itself. Let's leave that one alone. But Leo, there is something so beautiful, and viewers, listeners, we wanted you to read it also on page 248, this quote from Druso, because it's so powerful, Leo. You mentioned responsibility that each person should have, and he quotes the following. It's the middle of page 248. Druso says, "It is crucial that we understand that all the evil we knowingly do, somehow creates a lesion in our conscience, and that every such lesion causes a disturbance or malformation in the organism that exteriorizes our mode of being." So, in other words, what that means is, for instance, if I decide to kill myself by drinking a poison, my corresponding vital center or chakra will be damaged, and perhaps in that life, or if you don't pass away, in the next lifetime, and perhaps many future lifetimes, that particular area of the body will always, for a time, will manifest the problem. And actually, in this book, Between Heaven and Earth, is a great example of that, the case of this boy named Giulio who commits suicide by drinking a poison, and so thus he has several incarnations where he has problems all surrounding respiratory issues of his neck. So I think in so many ways that's what they're also talking about, right?
That is correct. And it's interesting for you to bring this highlight as well, because with obviously in the chapter there are many highlights that we could bring, but it brings us to it helps us as we see these difficulties. It makes us ask why we're going through such a suffering, right? And obviously, as we were saying here, the responsibility you just mentioned, if I have created this damage, obviously I have to reap the consequences. I have to clear that out of my body, right? To make sure that I expel that out of my body. A consequence that was created by one of my actions. And there is something else that we would like to quote. It's on page 249. as we go through these difficulties, these moments, these trials in our lives, right, that perhaps we created, Andre Luiz, actually, Druzo explains that evolving towards God can be compared to a divine journey. The good is a signal of free passage to the summits of the higher life, while evil represents a sentence of interdiction, forcing us to stopovers that are more difficult or less difficult to readjust. And we kind of joke about the toll booth, right? We drive on the highway, and if you have that little box that lets you just go zip through it, the easy pass, you just zip through it, you don't have to stop. But when we create issues, it's like losing that little easy pass, the little box that we have to stop, pay, and then take the change if you have to take the change as well, and then continue on with your path. And this is, again, the ascension towards God. It's a beautiful thing that perhaps allow us to say, well, before I go ahead and make this, make this decision or do something that perhaps will harm me and harm others, you know what? I'm not going to go ahead and slow my trip down. Let me just continue on with that easy pass, doing my good deeds and trying my best so I can reach this perfection faster in a more elevated way. So I think it's a beautiful thing that perhaps with the responsibility, it also helps us to aim for something higher, which is our Creator, definitely.
Absolutely. There's something interesting they talk about here. It's on page 251 of the Regimen of Sanctions.
Yes.
It's really interesting, is it not?
Regimen of Sanctions. And we go back to, again, now finally going back to the title, Sanctions and expiation, and assistance. And we see here the regimen of sanctions. What is this regimen? What is this idea? It's, as Eladio asked surprised, regimen of sanctions. And then Eladio says, yeah, exactly. We're not talking about measures of moral nature by which in our families or in our inner struggle we meet up with spirits to whom we are debtors or patient in tenderness, tolerance, and sacrifice in order to pay certain debts that taint our journey. What they're talking about here is actually trials that we ask to go through because we have done so many wrongs over and over again throughout many reincarnations that now we say, I can't do it, I need some help. I need some kind of sanction, something to stop me and put me in my place that perhaps I will not fall into the same temptations. And we are asking for. We're asking for.
So it's interesting, Leo. There's so much in this chapter we could talk about. I mean, the Regimen of Sanctions, and we recommend you to go and read and study about it because they go into different diseases that occur. In actuality, one of which that's called esophageal stenosis. Some of these diseases can actually appear in childhood. So we see children at a young age with these types of issues. So we know it's there, it's set in place to even at a very early age to remind the spirit of its purpose, of its goal in life. And this chapter really makes us look at illness differently, and it makes us look at pain very differently. That instead of looking at pain as something difficult, something that we want to anesthetize ourselves from, instead of anesthetizing ourselves, how about asking how this situation can teach me? How I can learn from this situation, because that ultimately is what we want to do, right? Right, correct.
Before we go to the end of the chapter to finalize it, there is something that we would like to add to this comment that you just made when we go to the different type of pains. That on page 254, there are remedies that Druzo also brings, but there is something really important that I would like to make sure that we leave our viewers with. On page 253, it talks about humility. Whether we're going through the difficulties of life or not, whether we have certain capabilities that we can help others, Druzo says, humility in any situation turns on a light in our souls, generating blessed resources of fraternal sympathy all around us. All around us. So humility is one of the key elements for us to endure our difficulties. And also, as we were discussing, if we have an ability, a capability to help someone, let us be humble as well and exercise.
Right, absolutely, Leo. And he goes on to talk about the need for prayer also to help us, because prayer isn't going to change necessarily the situations, but it'll help us endure our hardships. So, dear friends, we recommend you to go read the whole chapter, be enlightened, and be encouraged. As always, we wish you many blessings.
Thank you.